Well, thank you very much for this invitation to be with you today. My topic is about looking at the political landscape of South Africa, which is, as a political scientist, it is a very demanding task because this is a moving target that is with lots of dynamics all the time. So I will try to present to you a number of matters. It's obviously not going to be about everything that is taking place in South Africa from a political point of view, but it is certainly, I think, will try to identify some of the most important uh, elements or some of the most important milestones of what we have to take into account under the current conditions in South Africa. So first of all, I want to look at what dominates the political landscape at the moment. And I want to look at four elements. And there's obviously will be more, but I think these four are very much defining the politics of South Africa at the moment. The first one will not be a surprise for you, and that is that the implications of the pandemic certainly has lots of important political implications. The first one of that is the regulations, and many of you will be very familiar with the impact of the regulations, not only from the point of view of how we lived the last number of months, but also how it affected us even from a political point of view and the political ramifications of that. A lot of them were seen as either illogical or irrational, or just made an impact on the life of all of us. And it started to have some political meaning in the sense that, and I will discuss that a little bit later on also. The second one is the economic impact. And I think this is something which all of us, and you specifically, will be very much part of and familiar with and understand what is meant by this. And it's not only about the pure economic aspects of it, but the political consequences of the economic impact. And it is about the socio-economic conditions that are worsening in South Africa, the unemployment that increased, the fact that many businesses closed, the fact that the government is seen as partly or to a large extent is kept responsible for these consequences. So therefore, again, it is something which has large implications from a political point of view. Then another aspect which I think which has maybe not so prominent, but which had some implications, is the fact that the pandemic and the lockdown had serious impediments on political activity. And I will come back to that later also. But for example, the way in which political parties and opposition parties could function during this time, the way in which Parliament could function during this period, was very much a direct result of the pandemic. Then what we've seen lately, or over the last number of months actually, is how the social media has become very much active, some would say completely overheated almost, in terms of commenting on the current conditions. And then what we are also seeing and have experienced is an increased use of courts by both political parties as well as NGOs, as well as business groups, in order to push back and to deal with the implications of the pandemic. So this is the first, I would say, very important component that deals or influences the political landscape. Well, the second component or that influences the political landscape are governance problems. And those include service delivery issues, the capacity of the state, and then also corruption. These are elements which are not necessarily linked to the pandemic. It is much of a longer-standing issues, but they continue to play a very important role in the way in which the citizens, the voters, how they look at government and how they look at the problems that they experience on a daily basis. That influences also the way in which they look at political parties and at the government specifically. So that is an element that is sort of more behind the scenes, but it is something that determines the nature of South African politics to a large extent. The third element of the political landscape is the leadership problems that several of the political parties experience. We are very much familiar with the discussions about President Ramaphosa and his relationship with Ace Magashule and with Dr. Dlamini Zuma and others. But the same to a large extent applies also to the DA. We know about the fact that Mmusi Maimane resigned as the leader of the DA, and that they are basically having an interim arrangement at the moment with John Steenhuisen. But this has to be concluded at some point. And for the moment, it definitely influences the way in which the DA also functioned. Then the fourth element, which I think it's not so prominent, but it's going to become more prominent in the near future, is the fact that at some point in time, it is supposed to be next year, there should be a local government election. However, there's more and more of a discussion, of a debate about the postponement of that election, and in order to synchronize it with the national and provincial elections in 2024. At the same time, the Constitutional Court delivered a judgment that instructed Parliament to change the Electoral Act and therefore the electoral system to include also independent candidates in future for national and provincial elections. Now, the combination of these two elements will have a major impact on the way in which we will have elections in future. And because elections are so important as a political determinant, this is something which I think we need to have a close look at of how it is going to develop over time. Now to look at what I would call the abnormal situation that we have in a political sense because of the pandemic. The state of disaster, as it was declared at the end of March, definitely limited and still limits our constitutional rights. And that is because of this abnormal nature of a state of disaster, the same with a state of emergency. But most of the courts, including the Constitutional Court, have said this is possible from a constitutional point of view for a limited period of time. And that is, for example, why the state of disaster must be renewed now on a monthly basis. It means, therefore, that normal political activity is at the moment impossible. We see it, for example, with respect to Parliament that has hybrid sessions. We've seen it when the President last week answered questions, that it was also in the form of a hybrid session. That the oversight functions of Parliament is also limited because of the fact that Parliament is not convened in its normal or conventional way. And then another aspect which I think affects political parties and especially opposition parties quite severely is the fact that they don't have the same exposure in Parliament as is normally the case. And therefore they don't have a stage in terms of presenting their views in the same effective way as in the past. So purely from this point of view, it has a negative impact on the way in which politics is conducted at the moment in South Africa. The lockdown regulations, and I think there's lots of stories and jokes and anger about these regulations, definitely also had a direct or still have a direct impact on the political situation in South Africa. As you know, some courts concluded that some of them were justified, but many of them were irrational or illegal. I mean, many will refer to the tobacco situation, the alcohol situation, and also the curfew and other things. The result of that, or the consequence of that, is that it really reduced the legitimacy, especially of government, but I would say even sometimes of other role players in the lockdown situation. It also introduced the political support for the lockdown. And it has had, I would argue, especially a bad effect on Dr. Dlamini Zuma. And if she had some presidential aspirations for the future, I think the lockdown was not a good thing for her to promote her as a politician for the future. The lockdown regulations also at the same time, and this is where the political significance of it comes in, was seen as an encroachment on the democratic rights of South Africa. And there was even some talk about that South Africa is on its way towards an autocratic, or some people even talk about a totalitarian situation. Luckily, I would say now that we are at levels 2, that type of sentiments have been reduced to a large extent, and there's not the same sense of risk or of feeling that we are sliding towards an undemocratic situation. So it looks as if the democratic essentials, the democratic fundamentals in our society were still strong enough in order to carry us through this period. But there was really some concerns about some autocratic behavior in some instances. Also part of the pandemic and the political significance of it is that there was a lot of discussion, and it's still to some extent continuing, about the power struggle within the ANC, about who was really in control of managing the pandemic. Was it President Ramaphosa? Was it the Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize? Was it the Minister of Finance, who had his own ideas, Tito Mboweni? Was it Dr. Dlamini Zuma, or was it Ace Magashule, the ANC's Secretary General? So these were discussions about, in essence, what is the power relationship within the ANC, and who are the real decision makers. I think, again, the fact that we have now gone to level 2 means that that debate, to a large extent, actually, have been overtaken by events. And as I will show in a moment, or discuss in a moment, the talk now is more about who is in control of the decision making with respect to how to deal with corruption. The debate about the pandemic, I think, and it is not a South African debate, it's a worldwide debate, is very much about how governments have to take decisions in which they have to weigh health considerations up against economic considerations. And that's one of the most difficult debates. And it has become a political debate. It's not only a purely debate about the economic situation. It is a debate about what are the main concerns, the main interests that the government must deal with and take into account and care for under conditions like this. But even after or post the pandemic, this will become certainly also an issue that still will continue, especially how to recover from the consequences of the pandemic. This will become a serious debate from a financial or fiscal point of view, as well as from a point of view of how to deal with the structuring of the economy, the arrangement, the opportunities created for economic recovery. Then another point which I've mentioned just earlier on is there's some talk about the implementation of the anti-corruption actions. And as we've seen for quite some time now, there seems to be a contestation between, on the one hand, President Ramaphosa, who is firmly in favor of taking action against corruption, and then those who are associated with corruption or who are seen to be close to people associated with corruption, who tries to push back. That I think has become one of the main contestations between ANC and government. Now, to look now specifically at the situation in the ANC and at the same time in government, I think many people will say, well, it's a question about poor management, corruption, and then in general, how the ANC is inundated with the problems of the legacy of President Zuma. So that, I think, is sort of the framework within which a lot of what is happening in the ANC is looked at. My interpretation of the current situation, or actually since he became president, is that President Ramaphosa is using what I would refer to as a reform approach to deal with the legacy of President Zuma. And to reform in terms of state institutions, and especially the criminal justice system, in which he is trying to change them, especially in terms of leadership, and try to get rid of the state capture and the corruption and the factional elements in those institutions. Then also he places nowadays, and the government in general, a lot of emphasis on the infrastructural development as a catalyst for economic development in general. At the same time, foreign direct investment. We know about the number of international conferences he already convened to promote foreign direct investment in South Africa. Job creation is very much an overall concern, an overall priority for government, given the economic consequences, not only of the pandemic, but very much now also because of the pandemic. Social welfare is because of the unemployment and inequality problems is obviously therefore at the same time a priority. And then something which is not so much in the news, but which does receive a lot of attention is reform of the state-owned enterprises. The leadership in many of them have changed since President Ramaphosa came to power, and that is certainly continuing. What happens with ESCOM and SAA is maybe dominating the news, but a lot more is happening in the other SOEs also. Then he's at the same time also reforming the ANC's or the government's leadership. And this is again not something which is always in the news, but he to a large extent removed most of President Zuma's supporters from positions in government, in cabinet, in the state-owned enterprises. In SARS, Tom Moyane is not there anymore. In the criminal justice system, most of the persons leading the police, the intelligence services, the WOCs, the National Prosecuting Authority have been replaced in the meantime. And then even members of parliament. So that I would say is a gradual process, and that's why I refer to it as a reform process, which is taking place without being in the news all the time. However, there are some ambivalence in this, and this is, for example, the cases of Zanele Gumedi and the VBS Bank, where some people who've been involved in that have been reappointed. So, unfortunately, from Ramaphosa's point of view, or even our point of view, this trend has some contradictions, and there's some ambivalence in it, which makes its impact not as much as it is supposed to be. Now, what we are seeing lately is President Ramaphosa's approach to corruption. And I think this is possibly now one of his most important priorities. And in the last 2 weeks now, a lot has happened actually. First of all, the negative public sentiment, and there's, for example, in the social media, this movement called Futsek ANC, plus the risk that the ANC can lose elections in future, I think has given President Ramaphosa enough ammunition to argue within the ANC that serious action against corruption is non-negotiable. It's not something that they can really talk about anymore. And what he wants to do currently is to try to develop a groundswell or a momentum in order to promote that. And we've seen that, for example, in August, that there were in the beginning of August and the end of August, 2 National Executive Committee meetings were held, which is completely unknown for, that they have so many meetings of the highest decision-making body of the ANC when there's not a conferencing session. Plus, he sent a very powerful letter as the ANC's president to members of the ANC of about 7 pages, in which he absolutely emphasized the importance and, again, the non-negotiable nature of acting against corruption. That was endorsed by the National Working Committee, the Management Committee of the ANC, as well as the National Executive Committee. So what we are seeing is that President Ramaphosa, despite all the criticism about him and his lack of action in the view of many, is at least very much consistent on the notion of acting against corruption. And what I think what he is working towards at the moment is to try to build up a momentum of an anti-corruption campaign. Now, what is the effect of that for the ANC? The effect is that it affects the power balance within the ANC, because in a sense the references to corruption has become a code word for referencing or referring to Ismail and his supporters. Therefore, to talk about anti-corruption is almost synonymous with saying there's a willingness to act against not only corruption, but to act against them also. And therefore, to take decisions by the National Executive Committee or the National Working Committee gives President Ramaphosa a mandate, the legitimacy, in order to take decisions which, in effect, strengthens his position in the internal power balance relationship within the ANC. And I think this is where we are at the moment. This is the critical factor at the moment within the ANC, is that by coincidence, one can argue, the effects of the pandemic has given him the opportunity to deal with internal ANC matters that are coming a long way already, and that might now be, because of his initiative on corruption, sway the balance very much in favor of him. Now, the support, the question is who's supporting the ANC and what is the role of factions within the ANC? I would say many people are still talking about factions, and I would say the situation has changed in my mind. Around the time of the National Conference of the ANC in 2017, when President Ramaphosa was elected as ANC president, the factions were organized mainly around ideological issues. For example, the idea of radical economic transformation, especially on the side of the Dlamini Zuma group, and it focused on issues like how to change the Reserve Bank and its mandate, the land issue, expropriation without compensation, but prescribed assets and other similar matters. That has changed now in the meantime, I would argue, to groups, and not necessarily factions anymore, but groups that are formed around what I would call strong or influential men and sometimes women within the ANC, and that they became the focus areas for patronage systems or patronage networks. And the idea of that is to have access to material benefits or to positions, for example, to become elected as a councillor in a local government. And that is, in my mind, the internal dynamics that we are seeing at the moment in the ANC. So it's very little about ideological issues and much more simply about material issues. So and that's, I would therefore argue that the old Cyril Ramaphosa, Dlamini Zuma dividing lines are not so clear anymore. For example, the Premiers League has almost disappeared. The two main members of it, Ismail and Supremo Mapelo, as premiers, are not premiers anymore. The premier of Mpumalanga, David Mabuza, is not the premier anymore, but now the deputy president. What has happened is that President Ramaphosa, in the meantime, has been sort of instrumental in replacing them with premiers that are much closer to him. Take, for example, in the Northwest, Jobs Magoro, who is much closer to President Ramaphosa than Mapelo in the past. What we have also seen is that KwaZulu-Natal, that was the main center of the Zuma or Dlamini Zuma faction, has become much less factional. And they are very strong supporters of President Ramaphosa now in government, like the Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, the Minister of Public Administration, Senzo Mchunu, and the Minister of Police, Bheki Cele. What we are seeing with respect to the group that was the opposition for Ramaphosa, Magashule, Mamapelo, and others, is that they, to a large extent, their power depended on their alliance to the provinces and the ANC's leadership within the provinces. At the moment, one can say it's maybe only the provinces of the Free State and the Eastern Cape that are still, to some extent, on their side. Mpumalanga, after Didi Mabuza left, is very much unclear where they are. And I think what we are seeing is the fact that in so many of these provinces, there are major problems with the local authorities. And in the past, they was the foundation on which the premiers could become involved in corrupt activities. We've seen that especially, well, in both the Free State and the Northwest. But because many of these authorities are now placed under administration, it means that same political networks are not so easy to use anymore. And that over time is going to reduce their power balance. So it's not about dramatic moves that are taking place, but rather these dynamics that are taking place over time. Now, what is the nature of the ANC support at the moment? I think there are serious concerns, and ironically so, in a province like KwaZulu-Natal, where last year with the national and provincial elections, the ANC lost 10% of their support. About 9% of that went to the EFF. The same applies to Gauteng. In Gauteng, the ANC has at the moment a majority of merely one seat in the provincial legislature, 50.13%. In the Western Cape, they have lost and they could never recover so far. In the Northwest and Limpopo, they are in relatively strong position, but that's where the EFF is the strongest and the official opposition. So the ANC, to a large extent, has still significant support in rural areas. But in the urban areas, the DA, the EFF, and other parties are now the dominant party. So the nature of support for the ANC has changed quite dramatically. Now we look at the DA. The DA as the main opposition, the official opposition party, I would argue is in a period of transition at the moment. It is in terms of its leadership that the move from Mmusi Maimane to a new leader, at the moment John Steenhuisen is the acting one, and that contributes to this notion of a transition that is taking place. At the same time, the fact that the DA's power base for many years has been predominantly the Western Cape and Gauteng, that is over time now also changing to make it more of a national party. And we have seen lately that, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, the DA is growing and is in a much better position. What is also contributing to the transition is the return of Helen Zille to the national politics of the DA. That I guess, given the results of last year, that her role is very much now to try to stabilize the DA in the Western Cape, because they've lost support there, as well as the white component of their support base. I think what is at the moment two challenges for the DA is, first of all, that they have to define how they want to play the role of an opposition party. Mmusi Maimane, especially towards the end, adopted a very critical stance towards the government, especially. But in that sense, he defined the DA as a critical opposition, very similar to what Tony Leon and others did before him. Versus, for example, Helen Zille, who since 2008 defined the DA as a party, as government in waiting type of party. And that is why she positioned the DA to become the governing party in the Western Cape and in several local authorities also. The question now is, how is John Steenhuisen going to do it? Because he criticized Mmusi Maimane for being too critical. And I think what is, although he himself has become very critical and is quite similar in terms of the approach of Mmusi Maimane, he promised that he's going to have a more sort of constructive approach in terms of the role of opposition party. But that is still outstanding to a large extent because he hasn't been elected. He's an acting leader and therefore cannot really assert himself in the role of leadership. At the same time, the Federal Congress that was supposed to be held earlier on this year already was postponed because of the pandemic, and they are now talking about a virtual conference or Congress towards the end of the year. But those things, no, such an event will to a large extent, I would say, assist in providing a better definition of what the DA is going to be in future. The same applies to some of its policies. Mmusi Maimane was very much criticized for the fact that its policies were ambivalent or even contradictory. And policies, especially on socio-economic issues and those that are influenced by consideration of race versus the individual, like, for example, Black economic empowerment, about employment equity, about land reform, and others, those are at this stage quite controversial within the DA, and there's no absolute or real consensus about what are the DA's policies on that. Gwen Ngwenya, who's their leading person in terms of policy, the policy unit, she is back. She left because she didn't agree with Maimane, and she's back now and taking the lead again in the development of policies. The role of Herman Mashaba and Patricia de Lille as possible opposition and competition for the DA is also a factor. The Mashaba factor is much unknown. Patricia de Lille participated in last year's election with a party called Good. She didn't do very well, only in the Western Cape and to some extent the Northern Cape, but not in the rest of the country. My expectation is that the same will possibly apply to Herman Mashaba, that he will be able to get some votes and support in Gauteng, but not necessarily in the rest of the country. Then the DA is playing quite a prominent role at local government level, but it's a mixed record. They are relatively strong in the Western Cape, but since the 2016 local government election had quite a lot of problems with some of their mayors, and mayors had to be replaced and recalled. So it wasn't as easy as was expected. Then the DA's role in coalition governments, I think, are relatively well known, especially in the metros of Johannesburg, Tshwane, and the Nelson Mandela Bay. But the situation has become very much in flux because the DA lost its positions in all three of them. But there's not really a secure alternative for their position because, in essence, it's a very unstable coalition situation, and the fact that the EFF was not part of the coalition it exacerbated the problem. The DA also lost lately some coalition partners and therefore the government position in quite a number of towns, especially in the Karoo, because of the role of the Karoo gemeenskapsorganisasie. So one has to look at what is happening not only in the metros, but also what is happening in the smaller places where the DA is in a dominant position at local level. Now, lastly, we can look at the EFF. And the EFF is a difficult party to analyze because there's so much that you see in terms of the visuals, and there's not always a lot that you can use in terms of substance. But I think what is an established fact is that the EFF is in essence competing with parties like the ANC and all of that left of the ANC. Is not at all in competition with the DA and with more centrist type of parties. The EFF is largely supported by the young people, the young voters of 35 years and younger. By far the majority of them are living in urban areas, and by far the majority of those are living in Gauteng. As you can see, it is around about 40% of the EFF's support in terms of votes they receive from within Gauteng. The ideology is, many people believe they are just a communist party or a Marxist party or so, but the ideology is actually a little bit more mixed. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the fact that they have such different, on the one hand, a more of a socialist approach, on the other hand, a nationalist approach, and as well as mixing it with a sort of a state capitalism, makes it very difficult really to define of what is their policies and their ideology, except that it is definitely left of the center. Its support base, as I said, is mainly in Gauteng, which is then followed by the two provinces where they are the official opposition, the Northwest and Limpopo. And then in KwaZulu-Natal, they did quite well in the 2019 election, where they increased their support with about 9%. The dilemma for the EFF is that because their main support comes from the youth in urban areas, and those young persons are not very eager to vote. Their voter turnout is very low. It means that in a sense, their real support base is not reflected in Parliament. At the same time, the fact that it's the youth in the urban areas, while they have an ideology which is more socialist in nature, and concentrating on people that say are in the rural areas and don't have land, for example, means that there's actually a disconnect between the urban youth, who are much more middle class type of persons, versus the ideology which refers to poor people and people in rural areas. So I think that is one of the internal contradictions in the EFF that they couldn't resolve yet. The EFF is most effective at the national level, and we see it when you watch TV and the debates in Parliament. There they are quite effective, and they are also effective to mobilize symbolic issues, nationalization, for example, land issues and land occupations and those things. But they are not so good with issues about detail. That is why they tend to keep away from governments that deal with detail matters, like, for example, local government. They have for themselves, unfortunately, been sidelined in the metro councils and in the coalitions. They were first seen as the kingmakers in Joburg and in Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. But they have lost that position. They have become aware of the fact that they are not seen as part of the parties that are gaining experience in government, but are standing on the side and only deciding now and then when they become involved in the activities of the coalitions. So they changed their mind and started to negotiate for positions of being mayors in Tshwane or in Nelson Mandela Bay. And the ANC and the DA simply didn't accept it. So in the end, the result is that in all three cases, they were sidelined and are now very much on the margins. And I think that has a very detrimental effect on the EFF in general. The main issues for the EFF, and I'll simply mention them quickly, are about nationalized land, about what they refer to as the white monopoly capital, as black consciousness matters. And then I think that one of the biggest headaches for the EFF is that they could very much mobilize against President Zuma in Parliament and other places about that he must pay back the money. And now that President Zuma is not there anymore, they find it exceptionally difficult to find a replacement for that sort of single issue on which they can mobilize. So in that sense, I think the EFF has grown over the last three elections incrementally, not in an exponential way. And that is most possibly what will happen in future. So their prospects are moderate, it's conservative to some extent, and not what they want of an explosion of new support. So in conclusion, I would say the politics of South Africa at the moment and the political landscape is certainly dominated by the pandemic. At the same time, it is also dominated by government and not so much by political parties, not even the ANC. And I think this was to the advantage of President Ramaphosa during the last number of months, is that the focus about the pandemic was so much on the government and the government actions that all other, the ANC as party, as well as the DA, the EFF and others, actually sort of disappeared off the radar. And that worked, I think, ultimately in favor of government or the ANC. The pandemic has also delayed a number of important political events. In the case of the ANC, it is the National General Council conference that were delayed or postponed. In the case of the DA, it is their federal congress that was supposed to be held uh, together with their policy conference, but that will now be held at a later stage. The economic impact of the pandemic is, I would say, the predominant factor at the moment on the political landscape. It created lower confidence in government. It accused politicians for the problems, for the economic problems. And in general, I think the credibility of politicians and political parties are at the moment relatively low. The options for South Africans, unfortunately for us, are at the moment also very few. If you are unhappy with the current political parties, whether it's the ANC or the DA, or even for some the EFF, there are very few alternatives. Herman Mashaba's new movement is not yet on its feet, and others that are maybe in the pipeline, Musi Maimani's movements, none of them has at this stage the potential to really become a very prominent alternative. It is also very much unclear who's going to benefit from the current situation. No one of the opposition parties are actually standing out that they have said because of the unhappiness or the criticism of government, and by implication the ANC, any of the parties like the DA or the EFF have benefited from it. That is not clear-cut. I think finally, what we have to have also is a bit of a perspective about where do South Africa stands in relation to the rest of the world. With respect to the problems that we are experiencing, we are not the exception. We are not unique in that. We are actually very much in line with what's happening in most other countries. There's general public discontent. I don't have to refer to the US, where we are seeing that in an extreme form almost. But the politics are problematic in most of these countries because of the dire economic situation. And I think because of that, it gives us to some extent some hope that we are going to grow out of this situation together with other countries. And the fact that we've received some support from other countries and from international financial support, I think is indicative of the fact that we are not regarded as a basket case, but rather as something that must be treated together with the other emerging markets. And maybe the last point is to say that the fact that we are one of the emerging markets of the world is possibly one of the key components that will determine our future. Thank you very much.